Hi everyone. Welcome to Posette, an event for Postgres 2024. My name is Varun Dhawan. I'm a product manager with Azure Postgres team at Microsoft. Today, I'm going to talk about top features that make Azure Postgres great for developers. I believe this will be an interesting talk for anybody who wants to start developing on Postgres, whether community Postgres or Azure specifically on Azure Database for Postgres. So thanks for joining in, and let's get started. So my talk today is about what makes Azure Postgres great for developers. Before we get started, a little bit about me. So I've been working on databases, specifically relational databases, for past 20 years. Most recently with Microsoft, but in past I've worked, in Target, as a DevOps engineer, and then I've also worked with McKinsey, in their SRE team. I've particularly worked a lot on SQL, Postgres, and Oracle. And then I have some experience working on NoSQL databases like Influx, Elastic. The key thing is that I love blogging. So I run a blog by the name datanerd.blogs. Do check it out. And then other than that, I heavily contribute, towards a product blog. And these are some of my social handle. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and also on my GitHub. So today's talk, the agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to give you a very, very 300-foot overview of what exactly is Azure Database for Postgres, which is a flagship service for Azure Postgres. And then we'll dive into, the top features which we believe, makes, which are very developer friendly and, makes job of developer really easy. And then we'll just simply conclude. So let's see, what makes Postgres. Postgres is an awesome relational database. It's built for cloud. It has a lot of awesome things, like extensions, rich indexing, full text search, all the asset compliance, JSON support, now even the vector support. So that's the native Postgres, like right off the box. If you download Postgres, that's what you get. In Azure, we make Postgres, as a managed service. We offer it as a managed service, and we build a 360-degree layer of, the PaaS service around it, starting with security, global reach, ecosystem integration, built-in compliance, intelligent performance, high availability, scale up, scale out features, which is native, to the cloud. Management automation so that you don't have to do much of the task, like think about backups, high availability, disaster recovery. Like I can go on and on about all the things that DB and the devs have to take care even before they start working on the database. So once you use a managed service like Azure Postgres, you don't have to think about any of those features. The good part is that this is community Postgres. It's not a fork, so which means you get all the goodness of the Postgres right off the box. And on top of it, you can just start developing, for your application. So before we jump into what exactly developers like, let me take you to a little background about we've been running Azure Postgres for many years, and then what are the top use cases that we've seen people using or developers building against for Postgres. So one of those features is web application, the applications which mostly are cloud native or digital native applications, which typically needs very, very high, low latency and fast user experiences. The other class of application is enterprise application. Think about large ERP, CRM, HRMS, kind of solutions, which handle very, very large data sets. Which want to take advantage of, parallel queries. They can have unstructured data, so they are joining across data. So those are also a good typical use case. Then GIS kind of system. Think about apps like, Lyft or Uber, or wherever you ordered the food next, like all those applications that rely on, the geospatial data. Postgres has this amazing PostGIS instance, extension that brings in the spatial capabilities. So that's another class of applications. Financial services is a very strong, customer base that we see, which is using Postgres, specifically Azure Postgres. Given the 100% the asset compliance of Azure Postgres, it just makes it super ideal, for doing your OLTP type of workloads. And then finally, the newest to join this club is the AI and ML workloads. Like Postgres is at the forefront of the AI revolution, which we are witnessing right now. and given all the native vector capabilities, and then some of the work which I'm going to show you later in the slide that we have done, Postgres is really a standout databases, for applications, which, the AI ready applications or ML ready applications. So those are the top use cases. Let's go further. So I'm going to take you the series of, these features with some examples. So let's get started with the first one. So given we are a classic PaaS service, the first thing that we want to offer developers is we want you to focus on the code and not on the ops, which is reduce the ops as much as possible with offering a fully managed Postgres service. So what we see developers doing best or making the best use of time is, that we want you to spend time on designing schemas, writing queries, optimizing your application stack, make sure the performance is okay, make sure, there is no locking, blocking, connection overhead, those kind of things. So that's what we want you to do. And when developers leverage tool like Azure Database for Postgres, as their primary data store, what they get is the ease of management, whereby, okay, well, you don't have to think about a lot of mundane database tasks. Cost optimization, well, you don't have to think about how far you want to order servers, order machine, this is all cloud. You can scale up, scale down, whenever your requirement. Security and compliance comes inbuilt. We have, all the data is encrypted at rest. There is transport level security, which is enabled, and we try to keep up with the industry standards of, the security, whether it's SOX, HIPAA, GLB. Automated maintenance, the database is automatically maintained and patched every month. We let you decide a specific patching window. So all those things come in. Built-in high availability. Even if you don't choose an extra high availability, there is still built-in high availability. However, we recommend you to choose one of the available high availability options, to make sure your database is up most of the time. Peak performance, you can have like tons of parameters to, tweak the performance and make it up to the mark at which you want. There's built-in backup and recovery, which is like most important thing, you want to do with the data. And then finally, there is disaster recovery, and more recently, a geo-disaster recovery, whereby you want to protect against the complete regional failures. You can have one region going down, knock on wood, another region can completely take that over. Okay, point number 2 is the familiarity of the dev tools. Now, we want you to work with the tools that you know and love. It's just because like Postgres has been there for very long, and we don't want to take away all the native flexibility or familiarity of the tools that you've been using for very long. So with the Azure Postgres, you have all the native tools which are available. So on the left-hand side, you see the common development tools like Postgres command line, which I, personally use a lot. Then there is pgadmin. dbweaver is, again, one of the favorites. VS Codes, which, allows you to bring your application and bring your database all in the single pane of glass. And all the GitHub, goodness, including the GitHub Actions. If you use all those things, this is all available. You can still use it. You can even use things like PG Badger, PG Bouncer, which by the way, it's already built in. All those tools, are natively connect, with Azure Postgres. And then on the right-hand side is the languages, So I picked up, these are the top languages which we see developers using, so be it Java, Python, .NET, and Perl. I particularly love Go a lot, so Go, Ruby, C++. And then we are seeing, these cool new tools like the Superbase, and then specifically Data API Builder, the project that I'm particularly part of, where, these tools offer, connect to your database and convert your database into an API platform. All these tools just natively work with Postgres. Deploy in a snap. Now, the commitment that we offer is to make sure that when you are using Azure Database for Postgres Flexible Server, maximum deployment options are available to you. So you can not only deploy servers fast, but you can also manage your entire fleet in the easiest way possible. So we want to give you a lot of choices doing that. So our entry point, for, Azure as such and Azure Postgres is obviously the portal. It offers the most visual experience for, creating those workloads. you have all the options you can visualize, especially we see customers, visualizing a lot with the estimated cost, the calculator, which you see on the right-hand side. So that's a great place to deploy. But what if now you want to start deploying like tens and hundreds of servers in one particular go? Well, we also have CLI, the command line interface, whereby you can programmatically deploy all those things. You can code them into, your DevOps pipeline, so you can call the CLI command. The thing I want to call out over here is that every single feature which you see is available in the portal, we try to make sure that there is a complementary CLI command or tool also available for it. Well, going further in this journey, we also have Terraform integration, which is like one of the most popular, DevOps tool that you can manage large fleet of servers, with the Terraform deployments. You can manage your infrastructure as a code. If you want to change any parameter, you want to make sure that it always go through, the complete DevOps pipeline. Well, Terraform is the tool for you. And then finally, we have our own Bicep, which is built on top of, the ARM template. So Bicep is a domain-specific language built on top of ARM. And then you can have Terraform kind of deployment, but more native, to the Azure Postgres or Azure ecosystem. Now, let's take the deployment story a little further, and let me show you one more dimension of how it's easier to manage your workloads running, on Azure Postgres. So we see a common place to run your stateless application is Kubernetes. Assuming that you are using, you're already hosting your application on Kubernetes cluster, which is running on Azure, so AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service. Now, we typically see three deployment options which are available, and let's study them. So one, which you see on the left-hand side, is the Postgres flexible server instance, which is running on-prem or running on a VM. Now, this is an okay option. You can always run Postgres on a VM. It gives you all the flexibility, except you have to do a lot of plumbing and orchestration in terms of how your application, which is running on, Kubernetes, talk to the Postgres, which is running, on-prem. So there's a lot of coding which we see which is required, a lot of management which is required. Now, one way to ease the amount of coding and the amount of mundane work is to make sure that you can also have Postgres running on container. Now, Postgres can perfectly run on container as a technology. The only thing is that Postgres is a database, which means it automatically has the data, versus Kubernetes, which is mostly designed for stateless applications. So Kubernetes pod are transient, they fail over, and when they fail over, you have to make sure, that your data and your application is available. So beside that, it still bring you in the common control plane that you can have now your Postgres and your application in the same Kubernetes control plane. However, there are still things that you have to manage, as a developer or as a DBA. But then finally, what if you choose Azure Database for Postgres Flexible Server, which is hosted in the cloud, this can run in the same region, where your Azure Kubernetes workload is hosted. We can have the connections, automatically managed because it's all between the same Azure ecosystem. It can take advantage of network isolations like VNet or private endpoint. And now you do not have to even bother about, any kind of orchestration. All you need to do is just make sure, you're coding against your application, and all the bottom layer is automatically taken care of. Another cool thing, which even I came across very recently, is that we, in the Azure Marketplace, offer something like Azure Solution Ideas. The idea over here is to make sure that when you are building an application, you don't have to bother about, okay, what could be my big stack? Well, I'm developing an internet or mobile-based application, which will be running on Java. Well, I don't know what is the middleware I should be using or what database I should be using. If you go to Azure Marketplace and you search for something like a web app plus database, we automatically suggest, a complete set of the infrastructure tools which will complement, the kind of framework which you're using. So if you take this example from left to right, I'm building a browser or a mobile app. I go in the marketplace suggests me, well, we can build a complete Azure app service for you, which will be connected to your application. Your mobile app will be talking to your app interface using an API, and your APIs, will be talking to Azure Database for Postgres Flexible Server, which is the number 4 over here. And, the Postgres over here provides the relational database capabilities with obviously all the relational needs that you want from the database. the key point over here is that you, instead of provisioning and managing these things independently, now in Azure, it gives you flexibility to provision these things and manage them, from a single control plane in one single go, so makes the job really easy when you want to get started. This Azure solution idea is a recommended approach. Okay, now couple of times in my previous slide, I've mentioned we want to make it very easy for you to get started. Now, this slide is all about getting started easy and, still having a big potential as you go up. We want to make sure that the barrier to entry is very easy for developers. And we've think through, multiple things to make sure, we bring this idea, to the reality. So I have 4 different things to talk over here. Let's talk with the burstable SKU or burstable instances, what we call, at the first place. So burstable SKUs, is a standard SKU which is available in Azure. The idea behind burstable SKU is that when you are developing an application, there are times when you don't really know how your workload is going to be look like. It's your application is just new application. You're experimenting with an idea. You still want to make sure, when your application is running and if there is a spike in the load, you still want to be sure, that it's able to service it, but you are very conscious with the cost. Well, burstable SKUs are an option for you, whereby they make sure that when you have a specific CPU and memory capacity allocated, and if you're not using that capacity, you earn the credits towards not or use capacity. And then eventually, when there is a spike of the load and you want to use the CPU, you want to use this memory and IO, then it's just going to burst. It's just going to use those credit. It's not going to really bill you for that. So it's a very good option, save you tons of money, to get started with the burstable SKU. The other thing is start-stop, database instance. Well, it's a no-brainer. Running applications in the cloud, irrespective whether they're using it or not using it, will still incur a billing. We went ahead and we added this feature, which is start-stop instances, to make sure for most of the workloads, let's say your dev and test kind of a workloads, you don't want them to be up and online, 24/7 or working them over the weekends. But at the same time, we don't want you to destroy those instances and start them from the scratch, when you join, when you want them. With the start-stop instances, you can stop instances kind of, for the duration for you want, and then you can restart them whenever you're ready to use them again. The key thing is that the duration for which your instances are stored, we won't bill you for your compute, we won't bill you for your storage. Then there is reserved instances, or reserved instances is again an Azure-specific offering, which is also available for Azure Database for Postgres. Like typically you will go and you will purchase some kind of compute capacity on a pay-as-you-go model. Well, you need more, you provision more instances. If you do a little budgeting and you reserve some capacity in advance, what we have seen is that with the reservations done for 1 year up to 3 years, people can save up to 60% on the cloud compute costs. So reserve instances is a great way also to save costs on your cloud bill. And then finally, my favorite is the free trial. Well, everyone loves free stuff. We give a 12-month free trial, with Azure free account. So all you do is, go to, azure.com and just search for Azure free service for Postgres. You will have a homepage like this where you can just claim, your free account. And then I see, you get 750 hours of, the free service. You get 32 GB of, your database storage. In addition, you get 32 GB of your backup storage. And you just don't have the Azure database for Postgres, but you have many other services, which are available for free. So I'll highly recommend to use the Azure, free account for exploring some of these options. Performance. Well, as a developer, we always want to make sure, that the code we develop is working with the highest, performant level. We want to make sure, your application is always working with the least latency and the users are able to, get their work done always. Now, we typically as a PaaS service, one of the way we run, any kind of PaaS services to make sure we abstract, all kind of routine activities and routine management of databases from you. But then in Azure Postgres for Flexible Server, obviously, as the name suggests, we want to keep it a little flexible and offer back many controls to you. So let's see, how do we offer these controls back? So one way is allowing you the maximum control of your databases in terms of the server parameters. We allow, approximately more than 100 plus parameters which are configurable. Rest all the parameters are available for you to read only, so you can see all those values. You can configure CPU, which is the native elasticity of the cloud. You can, scale up, scale down, and you can scale these things independently: CPU storage, CPU memory, and storage, or you can scale them, together. The maintenance is configurable, so you can decide which day of the week you want to do maintenance. So that's an option. And then you can configure, other things like network, whether you want to do with the VNet isolation, whether you want to, enable private endpoint, to secure your instance. The other way is the tune performance. Like, you always want to make sure when you're developing against, your application, how is your production workload performing? How is your query performing? So we have this functionality or a feature called Query Store, which automatically, maintains the history of all the queries, which are being executed against the database. And then we allow you, and you can go and you can query the views in the query store, and you can do a lot of top-end analysis and find out, why something has been running low, why something, which are the queries which are running, with the highest duration. You can look into, their explain plan and find all those things. There are people or developers who say, well, we want more visually, appealing dashboards to quickly be able to tell which is like my, top performing query, do any kind of top-end analysis. Well, we have a feature called Query Performance Insight, which is actually built on top of Query Store. And then these has a very beautiful visual dashboard that you can do for doing top-end analysis, top CPU, top memory, top temp usage. And then finally, we have intelligent performance, by which we can automatically tweak, auto vacuum and write, for your database. And then maximum observability and monitoring. The saying is, if you can monitor something, you can improve it. We offer 70 plus monitoring matrix. There is logs available, so the logs are by default integrated with Azure Log Analytics. So you have powerful KQL and custom queries that you can run, do all kind of trendings with your logs. Or you can, most recent feature is that you can now download server logs. These are text files, as if like you are downloading the Postgres logs. You can run them against popular tools like pgvector, or do any kind of analysis with the logs. Finally, we have a seamless integration with Grafana, which is the most popular open source visualization tool, with the Azure Monitor plugin. So each of the 70 matrix that I talked about is, you can just visualize them in the Grafana. Connection management. Now, Postgres by design, has some opportunities, when it comes to the connection management. So if you see the diagram on the left, what happens is when your application make connection, to databases, with every connection, there is a little bit of a memory which gets consumed. Now, if the application is not doing a very good job of closing the connections, then the chances are that this memory resource goes wasted, and this could have been used for caching your data and making your application run faster. So typical recommendation is to use any kind of a connection pooler in between your application and the database. Now, Azure Database for Postgres, again, to make the job of developer easy, offers a built-in connection pooler, which is PG Bouncer. So PG Bouncers now just come built in. All you have to do is just enable the toggle, just turn it off or turn it on. We have the latest version of PG Bouncer. When you enable PG Bouncer, all you need to do is, instead of connecting to default port, which by the way is still available for connection 5432, all you do is start connecting to port 6432. And then you can also access, the PG Bouncer admin console if you want to be more geeky about it and want to see how is the connection management happening. Or we have PG Bouncer matrix for you to monitor, the connections. Extensibility. What really makes Postgres different from other databases, is the extensibility. Is like extensibility is the functionality, or it's the features that enhance your database with the powerful extension, which are tailor made for your need. So let's understand what are the extensions. So extensions, are these feature functionalities, which extend the Postgres beyond your, core database engine. You can load new set of functions, like new data types, new indexes, new operators. In the Azure Database for Postgres Flexible Server, we offer more than 60 plus third-party extensions, like the popular ones being pgvector, TimescaleDB. PG audit, which is very, very, useful for auditing. PG start statement, which is very similar to the query store. You can enable and disable these extensions using Portal or CLI. And then most recently, we have offered this, new feature by which you can actually upgrade the extension to the latest available version in Postgres. So it's very easy, to manage extensions, and you can use most of these extensions, which we have, to offer today. And then finally, we cannot go without talking, AI, which is like the big, revolution which is happening in the industry right now. Now, Postgres is at the forefront of this AI revolution when it comes to the database. Why? Because Postgres automatically comes with the support for, the vector data types. Now, there are a couple of things first we have to understand in terms of how is Postgres more well-positioned or the most well-positioned database to, for the AI kind of workloads. So first of all, I mentioned, Postgres supports the vector data types with the help of this pgvector extension. It's an open source extension which is gaining insane popularity in last 1 or 2 years. We offer the version 6.1. What vector data types allows you to do is that it allows you to natively store the vector embedding in your relational tables, just along, side by side with your data. And once you're able to store this data, then you can, do any kind of querying on the data. And there is indexing which is available like HNSW, IVF flat, by which you can query this data. And then once you have, the queryable data stored as embedding, then you can run any kind of, similarity searches. You can do natural language querying, with this. Now, there's one problem with the vector extension is that once you store the data, when these embeddings are stored, but then you want to have them talk to any kind of large language models like OpenAI or Hugging Face or Llama. In that particular case, you have to write a lot of code to make make that integration happen. Our team has been hard at work, to make sure that we bring AI capabilities at the forefront. So we launched, this Azure AI extension last year, which offers a very easy SQL interface to talk to, large language model like OpenAI. You can create embeddings. You have a native SQL interface, to query those embeddings, and it just completely, it's just complementary to pgvector. So let's see this with a quick example. So let's say I have a recipe database, which is like, think of us as being a restaurant. I have tons of recipes over there. And then, in the recipe database, you see, I don't have a column. I just want to make sure that how can with the natural language querying, I can query, data in the recipe database. So if I create the Azure AI extension, all I need to do is, create the extension, provide it with an endpoint and API key so that I can securely communicate, to my large language model. And then I can run an update, on my table, 1 row or 1 million rows, and make sure in this particular case, the product description, I want to make sure that I, vectorize this particular data. Once I vectorize this data, it talks to the large language model, in this particular case, OpenAPI, and returns all the vectorized values, for me. And once these vectorized values are returned, they are stored side by side along with the product. So I have the column number 3, which is product description, and then my last column 5, which is actually the vectorized product embedding, which is there. So once I have this kind of a data, what I can do is, if you follow me from left to right, I have an application which is trying to make a natural language query call. So somebody's searching for, okay, well, in your recipe database, just return me all the high protein recipes, So this kind of queries goes to the database. Database in terms is going to make an API call, to the large language model, OpenAI in this particular case. OpenAI is going to return a lot of vectorized value back. And remember, these vectorized values which are returned back we can calculate some kind of similarity distance between the vectors which is stored inside our database. And that finally is returned to the user. So in this particular case, for a high protein recipe, I can see, it's returning me, something about chicken. It's returning oatmeal and salad. Now, none of these recipes actually have high protein embedded in it. It's just the large language model, doing the AI similarity search, and just it automatically knows, that each of these recipes and these ingredients are high in. So that's an example of, how easy it is and how out of the box it is for developers, to build an AI kind of an application with Azure Database for Postgres. So besides, once you have the vectoring capabilities in Azure OpenAI extension, it's not only the similarity search, but you can also do, you can also take, advantage of, the language search. You can call all the Azure cognitive services, things like machine learning, storage, AI services, and you can build all this new generation of application with Azure Database for Postgres. So let's do a quick repack. We kind of, went through 8 very quick things. Sorry if I was being fast, but high level, we want to make sure that you focus on the code, less on the operations. You use familiar dev tools. You can deploy, very fast. You can start easy and then grow as you go. Performance, we give you a lot of controls. We give you a lot of, lot of feature, configurability back to you. There is a built-in PG bouncer to help with the connection pooling. You can extend database functionality with all the awesome extension that Postgres has to offer. And then finally, it's AI ready with the pgvector extension and Azure AI extension. These are some set of resources which are available for you, especially, the blog, and then especially, our docs. And we try to, make sure the team is always hard at the work to make sure all the new good things and the features month on month are always available and documented for you. So I'll urge you to check those out. With that, I want to thank you again for staying with me for the duration of this talk. Hope you have something to learn about this and which you can take away, once you're developing. And just good to have you here, and enjoy the rest of your Posette conference. Thank you. Thanks again. Bye-bye.